December 14, 1985. 9:42 p.m. Sparks Steakhouse, Midtown Manhattan. The air in New York doesn't just get cold, it turns into a blade. On 46th Street, the wind whistles through the canyons of steel and glass, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts and diesel exhaust. Inside a black Lincoln Continental, the silence is heavy. A man checks his watch. A radio crackles. Then the sound that would redefine the American underworld, the rhythmic, metallic thud, thud, thud of a semi-automatic. Paul Castellano, the Pope of the Gambino family, is bleeding out on the pavement. In a doorway 2 blocks away, a man in a tailored Brioni suit lights a cigarette. His silver hair is perfectly coiffed, defiant against the gale. John Gotti doesn't look like a killer, he looks like the owner of the city. He doesn't look back at the chaos, he simply nods to a shadow and disappears into the night. To understand how a desperate Hollywood icon ended up owing their life to the man who just orchestrated the hit of the century, we have to look past the velvet ropes of the West Coast. 3 months prior, the sun in Los Angeles felt different. It felt like a spotlight that had been turned off. For Julian Vain, a name that once commanded $5 million a picture, the silence of his phone was louder than any gunshot. His mansion in Bel Air was a hollow shell. The marble floors were cold. The IRS had already frozen the offshore accounts, and a civil suit from a failed production was about to strip him of the last thing he owned, his reputation. Julian sat in his study, staring at a court summons scheduled for Monday. It was Friday. He had 72 hours before the world found out that the golden boy of the 80s was a ghost. He needed a miracle, or he needed a monster. He reached for a Rolodex and found a number scribbled on the back of a napkin from a trip to New York 3 years ago. Julian picked up the phone. In that moment, he traded his prestige for a debt that has no interest rate, only a soul-binding obligation. He knew the stories. He knew who Gotti was. But when the choice is between public execution by the press or a private pact with the devil always looks like a friend. The phone rang only twice before a gravelly voice answered. Julian didn't know it yet, but the man on the other end wasn't just going to fix his problem, he was going to own his future. September 12th, 1985. 11:15 a.m. Mulberry Street, Little Italy. The Ravenite Social Club was a modest storefront. To the average tourist, it was a place where old Italian men played cards and drank espresso. To the FBI, it was the most dangerous square footage in America. The smell of stale tobacco and anise filled the room. John Gotti sat in the back, leaning against a wood-paneled wall, surrounded by men whose names were whispered in the halls of the Justice Department. When the call from Hollywood came through the clean line in the back office, Gotti's underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, took the message. He walked over to Gotti, whispering in his ear. Gotti smiled, a sharp, predatory grin that never reached his eyes. "The actor?" Gotti asked, his voice a low rasp. "The one from the movie with the cars?" "He's broke?" "Worse," Sammy replied. "He's being squeezed by a predatory lender out in Vegas, a guy named Shark Moretti. Moretti doesn't care about Hollywood fame. He wants the house, the cars, and he wants Julian Vain to crawl." Julian Vain had spent his career playing heroes. He played men who stood up to bullies. But in the real world, Julian was drowning. His context was a decade of excess, cocaine-fueled parties at the Chateau Marmont, and bad investments in strip malls that never broke ground. He had become a victim of his own myth. He thought he was untouchable until the bank sent men who didn't care about his Oscar nominations. Gotti looked around the room. He loved the spotlight. He loved the idea that a man the world adored was coming to him, a man the world feared, for salvation. It reinforced the Teflon Don image he was building. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a fixer for the elite. Gotti stood up, smoothing the front of his $3,000 suit. "Tell the kid to stop crying," Gotti said. "Tell him to go to his court date. Tell him to sit there and look pretty. I'll handle the rest." Gotti walked to the rotary phone in the back. He didn't call a lawyer, he didn't call a banker. He dialed a number in Las Vegas. When Moretti picked up, Gotti didn't say hello. He said, "You're bothering a friend of mine, and that makes you a problem of mine. September 13th, 1985. 2:00 a.m. The Sahara Hotel, Las Vegas. Shark, Moretti, was a man who thrived in the neon-lit shadows of the Strip. He wasn't a made man, but he operated under the protection of the Chicago outfit, or so he thought. He held Julian Vain's debt like a leash. To Moretti, the $2 million Julian owed was more than money. It was leverage to get his foot into Hollywood production. He wanted Julian to sign over his likeness rights for a series of low-budget gambling promos. It would have been the end of Julian's career. The desert air was dry and smelled of dust and ozone. Moretti was in his penthouse counting chips when his private line rang. When he heard Gotti's voice, the color drained from his face. "John," Moretti stammered, his bravado evaporating. "I didn't know he was with you." He didn't say nothing. "He doesn't have to say nothing." Gotti's voice crackled over the line, cold as a tombstone. "I'm saying it. The debt is settled. You're going to send a messenger to his lawyer in L.A. By Monday morning, that contract needs to be confetti. If I hear Julian Vain's name come out of your mouth again, the next thing coming out of your mouth will be your teeth." Gotti didn't need to send an army. He used the weight of his name. In the criminal hierarchy, a word from the head of the Gambino family was a decree. Moretti knew that Chicago wouldn't go to war with New York over a Vegas loan shark and a washed-up actor. Moretti was a pawn who had accidentally stepped onto the King's Square. Back in L.A., Julian Vain was staring at a bottle of scotch, contemplating a permanent exit. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the headlines: "Golden Boy declares bankruptcy, evisceted from Bel Air." Moretti, shaking, called his legal team. He told them to drop the suit. He told them to eat the $2 million. He was terrified. He knew Gotti's reputation for disappearing problems. As the sun rose over the Mojave, a courier was dispatched to Los Angeles. But Gotti wasn't doing this for free. In New York, Gotti turned to Sammy Gravano. "Now," Gotti said, "we have a pet in Hollywood. Imagine what we can do with the studio's books." September 16th, 1985, 9:00 a.m., Los Angeles County Courthouse. The hallway was a gauntlet of flashing bulbs and shouting reporters. Julian Vain walked through them, his face a mask of practiced stoicism. He felt like he was walking to the gallows. His lawyer, a frantic man in a cheap suit, kept whispering about damage control and Chapter 11. Inside the courtroom, the air was stagnant, smelling of old paper and floor wax. The judge, a stern woman who had no patience for celebrity antics, glared down from the bench. On the opposite side, Moretti's high-priced legal team sat with stacks of documents ready to bury Julian. Julian sat down, his hands trembling under the table. He looked at the clock. 9:05 a.m. Then, something strange happened. One of Moretti's lawyers received a note from a bailiff. He read it, looked at Julian with an expression of pure confusion and fear, and stood up. He walked over to Julian's lawyer. "My client has decided to dismiss all charges," the lawyer whispered, loud enough for Julian to hear. "The debt has been restructured privately. We are filing a motion to withdraw the suit immediately." The courtroom went silent. The reporters froze. Julian felt the weight of the world lift off his chest, replaced by a cold, sinking realization. Gotti had done it. With one phone call, the most powerful legal machine in the city had been shut down. In the back of the room, a man in a dark suit wearing sunglasses despite the indoor lighting gave Julian a small, sharp nod. He was a friend of a friend from New York, sent to ensure the message was received. Julian stood up and walked out of the courtroom a free man. He told the press it was a misunderstanding that had been settled amicably. He smiled for the cameras. He looked like the golden boy again. But as he got into his car, he found a small white envelope on the seat. Inside was a single business card for a social club in New York. No name, just an address in Little Italy. Julian was no longer broke, but he was no longer his own man. October 20th, 1985. 11:00 p.m. A private suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel. For a month, Julian lived in a dream. The script started coming back. The banks reopened his lines of credit. He was the comeback kid. But the nightmare returned when the phone rang at midnight. It wasn't his agent. It was the gravelly voice. "Julian," Gotti said, "I'm coming to LA. I want to see the lights. I want you to show me the town." Gotti's arrival in Los Angeles was like a royal procession. He didn't sneak in. He stayed at the finest hotels, surrounded by a phalanx of cousins from Brooklyn. He used Julian as his entry ticket into the world of the elite. He wanted to meet producers, studio heads, and starlets. He wanted the glamour to rub off on the grit. The theme here was reputation. Julian's reputation was restored, but it was being poisoned by association. People in the industry started to whisper. Why was Julian Vain eating dinner at Spago with a man the FBI called the Dapper Don? Julian had to make a choice. He could distance himself and risk Gotti's wrath, the same wrath that silenced Paul Castellano, or he could become Gotti's puppet. In a dimly lit corner of a cigar lounge, Gotti leaned into Julian. "You know, Julian, movies are a lot like my business. It's all about who you know and who owes you. Right now everyone owes you, and you owe me." Gotti wanted Julian to influence a union vote at a major studio. The Gambinos wanted control of the craft services and transportation unions in Hollywood. It was a strategic move that would net the family millions in kickbacks. Julian agreed. He used his influence to set up meetings between Gotti's associates and the studio executives. He became the bridge between the boardroom and the back alley. The FBI, trailing Gotti from New York, caught it all on film. Julian Vain wasn't just an actor anymore, he was a co-conspirator, and the feds were looking for a weak link. November 5th, 1985. 3 a.m. A darkened office, FBI field headquarters, Los Angeles. The blue glow of a slide projector illuminated the face of Agent Frank Miller. On the screen was a grainy photo of Julian Vain shaking hands with John Gotti outside a restaurant. "We've been chasing Gotti for years," Miller said to his team. "He's a ghost in New York, but here in Hollywood, he's showing off. And he's using Vain as his shield. If we can squeeze the actor, we can get the Don." The atmosphere was tense, the room smelling of burnt coffee and desperation. The FBI had been embarrassed by Gotti's ability to beat every rap in New York. They saw Julian Vain as their silver bullet. Back in his mansion, Julian was losing his mind. He was drinking again. He could feel the eyes on him. He saw the same black sedan parked down the street every day. He realized that Gotti's gift was a gilded cage. Every favor Gotti did for him required two in return. The social consequence was immediate. His A-list friends stopped calling. The industry knew that Julian was dirty. He had traded his financial bankruptcy for a moral one. One night, Julian found Agent Miller waiting for him in his garage. "We know about the Vegas debt, Julian," Miller said, leaning against Julian's vintage Porsche. "We know Gotti made it go away. That's extortion, conspiracy, and racketeering. You're looking at 20 years, unless you help us." Julian had to decide between the mafia's code of silence and the government's promise of protection. If he talked, Gotti would kill him. If he didn't, he'd die in a cell. "I can't," Julian whispered. Miller smiled grimly. "Gotti doesn't love you, Julian. You're just a prop, and props get discarded when the scene is over." November 20th, 1985, 8 p.m., the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club, Queens, NY. Gotti was back on his home turf. The atmosphere was different here, grittier, more dangerous. The walls were thin, and the streets were lined with loyalists. Gotti was at the height of his power, but he was becoming paranoid. He knew the feds were closing in. He called Julian to New York. He didn't ask, he commanded. Julian arrived at the club looking out of place in his designer overcoat. The men in the club stared at him with cold, predatory eyes. They didn't see a movie star. They saw a liability. "The feds talked to you," Gotti said, not looking up from his cards. It wasn't a question. They approached me," Julian admitted, his voice cracking. "But I didn't say anything, John. I swear." Gotti stood up slowly. He walked over to Julian and straightened the actor's collar. It was a gesture of terrifying intimacy. "I like you, Julian. You're a talented guy, but in my world there are no golden boys. There are only brothers, and there are rats." The subtext was clear. Julian was being tested. Gotti wanted him to carry a message to a union leader who was hiding in Europe, a message that couldn't be sent by phone or by any made man who was being watched. Julian was the perfect courier. He had a reason to travel. He had cover. Julian took the envelope. He was now a literal bagman for the mob. He was no longer just a friend, he was an operative. As Julian walked out into the cold Queen's night, he realized he wasn't being followed by the FBI. He was being followed by Gotti's men. They weren't protecting him. They were making sure he didn't go to the police. December 1st, 1985, 11 a.m., Hotel de Paris, Monte Carlo. The Mediterranean was a sparkling blue, but Julian Vain felt like he was in a funeral parlor. He was there to meet Big Sal Melfi, a man who knew too much about the Gambino's international money laundering. The meeting was short. Julian handed over the envelope. Inside wasn't a message. It was a photograph of Melfi's daughter at her school in Connecticut. Melfi turned white. Julian realized then that he wasn't just a messenger, he was a delivery system for a death threat. The weight of what he was doing began to crush him. He was a man who had built a career on being loved, and now he was the face of a monster's malice. He spent the night in the casino, losing thousands he didn't have, trying to feel something other than terror. He called his agent from a payphone. "I want out," he sobbed. "I want to go back to how it was." "You can't go back, Julian," his agent replied, his voice cold. The agent had been visited by Gotti's men too. "You're in the sequel now, and in this one, the hero doesn't always win." Julian looked at his reflection in a shop window. He looked old. The golden boy was tarnished beyond repair. He realized that Gotti hadn't fixed his life. He had simply replaced one debt with another that could never be paid. Julian decided to disappear. He bought a ticket to a small village in Italy, hoping to vanish before the feds or the mob could find him. But when he checked into his boarding house, there was a bottle of wine waiting for him. The card said, "Enjoy the rest. See you in New York." JG, December 15th, 1985, 10:10 a.m., New York City. The news of Paul Castellano's assassination hit the world like a tidal wave. John Gotti was now the official boss of the Gambino family. He was the king of New York, but with that power came a massive bullseye. The FBI moved in. They didn't need Julian Vain to testify anymore. They had bugs in the Ravenite. They had tapes of Gotti talking about the hits, the unions, and the actor. Julian was brought back to New York in handcuffs. He wasn't a star anymore. He was material witness number 4. He sat in an interrogation room, the same room where hundreds of hoods had sat before him. "Gotti's going down, Julian," Agent Miller said, throwing a transcript on the table. "He talks about you on these tapes. He calls you the poodle. He says he owns you for the price of a phone call. He's laughing at you." The betrayal stung more than the threat of prison. Julian had thought in some delusional way that he and Gotti were friends. He thought he was special. He realized he was just a tool, a novelty that Gotti had used to amuse himself. The theme of power was now inverted. Gotti's power was his downfall, and Julian's weakness was his only way out. Julian Vain signed the cooperation agreement. He told them everything: the Vegas debt, the union meetings, the message to Melfi. He traded his final shred of legend for a chance to breathe air that didn't smell like a cell. The trial was set. The world was waiting for the showdown between the Teflon Don and the fallen star. But in the underworld, witnesses have a habit of not making it to the stand. April 2nd, 1992, 2:00 p.m., Federal Courthouse, Brooklyn. The trial of John Gotti was the hottest ticket in town. Gotti sat at the defense table, defiant, wearing a $5,000 suit, smirking at the cameras. He looked like he had already won. Then Julian Vain was called to the stand. The room went silent. Julian looked at Gotti. For a second, the actor's training kicked in. He stood tall. He spoke clearly. He detailed the one phone call that changed his life. He told the jury how Gotti used fear like a currency. Gotti's smirk vanished. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a man who had been outplayed by the very poodle he had mocked. Gotti was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life without parole. He would die in a prison hospital years later, a shadow of the man who once ruled Manhattan. Julian Vain disappeared into the witness protection program. The Golden Boy was gone. He lived out his days in a small town in the Midwest, working at a hardware store under a different name. No one knew he had once been the biggest star in the world. No one knew he was the man who helped bring down the last great godfather. Power isn't what you have, it's what you owe. And in the world of John Gotti, the fix is always more expensive than the problem. Julian Vain learned that the hard way. He saved his house, but he lost his life. John Gotti became a legend of the streets, a symbol of a bygone era of organized crime. Julian Vain became a footnote in a legal textbook. One man died in a cage, the other died in anonymity. Looking at the cost of that one phone call, the question remains, was it worth it? Would you have taken the deal, or would you have let the lights go out on your own terms? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. If you enjoyed this dive into the dark side of Hollywood and the mob, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories where the truth is stranger than the movies.